Major funding for this program was provided by the Open Society Institute. And by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
Corporate funding for this program is made possible by Dresser Industries. Energy is our business.
And by ADM. Feeding the world is the biggest challenge of the new century. ADM, supermarket to the world.
Russia in the 18th and 19th centuries became a deeply split society between old darkness and new enlightenment, between familiar countryside and the artificial new capital of St. Petersburg. Old Muscovy had defended its towns with high walls and a citadel at the center called a Kremlin, which in Russian means strong place. The Moscow Kremlin was the largest. Here, among the cathedrals, the Tsar and his courtiers lived cramped lives. The power of the Tsar was absolute in old Russia, and can be approached in the Moscow Kremlin only through a series of doors, rather like this, one which led in from where the noblemen, the senior noblemen, held council to where they met with the Tsar's closest advisors and where foreign ambassadors waited rather trembling to see if they could get in to see the Tsar himself. And it was through these doors that one finally went in to have one's audience with the Tsar, approaching slowly, moving to the place of honor, which it always was in old Russia, nearest to the stove where warmth and heat would come in these otherwise cold, dark, forbidding, and claustrophobic chambers. It was in places like this that one met Tsars like Ivan the Terrible. The world of power and authority in old Russia was almost exclusively male. Women looked on from afar through grills. They lived in a separate part of the palace. They worshiped in a separate part of the church. And it was the men who were the controlling force in the entire politics and the entire life of old Muscovy. This dark, inward-looking, all-male world was turned outward to face the light of Western Europe by two remarkable women who ruled Russia for most of the 18th century, the Empresses Elizabeth and Catherine the Great. The architect Rastrelli built for them some of the most sumptuous palaces and architectural ensembles in the world. At the dawn of the 18th century, Tsar Peter the Great turned away from the old church-dominated wooden world of Muscovy and cut a window to the west, creating a new capital on the coast of the Baltic. In place of paintings of saints, Peter and his successors used statues of mythological heroes from the classical world to legitimize and glorify power. The new capital was named not for him, but for the Roman St. Peter. St. Petersburg was to be the new Rome, the new capital for a vast, ever-expanding empire which now sought even to dominate the seas. Peter's city was haunted from the beginning. The place he chose could hardly have been less suitable. Granite had to be quarried and ferried over great distances from Finland in order to build firm quays and foundations on the swamps and islands of the estuary. Thousands perished in its construction. Peter initially built it as a bleak Dutch-style naval base to challenge the Swedes, but it rapidly came to embody an imperial vision for Russia itself. A city of endless colonnades, heroic statuary, and great architectural ensembles. A city designed not so much for people as for parade. Under the Angel of Victory, the largest monolithic granite column in the world, mass parades filled the broad streets of Petersburg. They stretched out through the city and continued into the Soviet period, when the city was renamed Leningrad. The central building in Petersburg is not a cathedral, but the Admiralty Building, capped by a navigational spire projecting Russian power out into the oceans. Peter the Great was the first Russian Tsar to study abroad. Anxious to make Russia a great naval power, he studied shipbuilding in Holland and in England, where he worked as an apprentice in the Royal Naval Dockyards, which a Russian sculptor is now commemorating. To celebrate Russia's great victory over Sweden at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, Peter ordered Peterhof, a summer palace complete with a vast cascade. Ingenious engineering fed the allegorical fountains. Samson slaying the lion symbolized Peter's triumph over Charles XII of Sweden. Rastrelli gave Peterhof its final form. A characteristic long, monolithic facade commanding a vista of fountains descending to the Gulf of Finland, all suggesting imperial control of the sea. Just as an icon was part of an entire screen in Muscovy, so a Baroque facade in Petersburg was part not just of an individual building, but of an entire architectural complex. And at the center of the new imperial capital was the Winter Palace, dominating the square and decked out by Rastrelli with nearly 200 rooftop sculptures. Statuary blends into gilded, swirling paintings on plaster in Rastrelli's characteristically ornate entrance from the square to the palace. Rastrelli's architecture gave a secular majesty to imperial power. He brought the gold down and in from the domes of churches to highlight the decor in this, the main Jordan staircase of the Tsar's glorious Winter Palace. Rastrelli was a master in handling processional space. Guests would progress along this great pillared corridor, past colorfully uniformed servants, and then ascend the heroic Jordan staircase. This magnificent cascade of marble steps took guests from the level of the New Jordan, the banks of the river Neva, upwards to the glittering throne room, as hovering gilded statuary and painted allegories drawn from classical antiquity looked down from the heavenly ceiling high above. It was Russia's great women rulers of the 18th century, Elizabeth and Catherine the Great, that turned Petersburg from stone into gold. So it seems appropriate that their favorite architect, Rastrelli, achieved perhaps his greatest architectural success here in creating a school for noble ladies. It's hard to say what this architecture was. It's usually called Baroque, but it's something original and distinctively Russian. Perhaps monumental Rococo is a better term. At first, the central church seems to be a traditional Russian one, topped with 5 domes. But the 4 supporting domes are elongated, purely decorative ones that do not enclose space. All 5, in effect, are a monolith, and space is enclosed by 4 other independent domes on the outer walls. The structure both illustrates and symbolizes the central concept of imperial architecture, control over space. Just as Petersburg controlled all of Russia's expanses, so the aristocrats who flocked to Petersburg wanted to control a little of their own space. The very word for aristocrat, dvoryanin, comes from the word dvor, or court, that little bit of the outdoors which they sought to control and have as their own symbol of power in this imperial city. St. Petersburg became a series of stately canals, heroic statues, bridges, and palaces along broad boulevards. In effect, an integrated architectural ensemble, an open-air theater set for the aristocracy, and an ideal backdrop for parades. In the less martial times of today's Russia, any excuse for a parade is hard to resist. This carnival-like procession was recently invented to celebrate the hitherto unknown festival called the Day of Petersburg. St. Petersburg has always been dominated by the Nevsky Prospect, the single long boulevard which leads to the Admiralty Building. Unlike the chaotic and often curvilinear cities of old Russia, Petersburg's streets follow straight lines of disciplined grid patterns, thanks largely to Catherine the Great and her dedication to the Enlightenment belief in rational city planning. Arches of triumph were a Petersburg specialty, and no arch was ever so triumphant as this entry point into the great square before the Winter Palace. Some sense of how Catherine the Great made her own grand court appearances inside the Winter Palace is provided in this reenactment from Tchaikovsky's opera, The Queen of Spades. Each summer, Catherine took her entire court from the Winter Palace to her Summer Palace, Tsarskoye Selo, in the nearby woods and countryside. I've always thought that the architecture of Tsarskoye Selo was designed to intimidate Catherine's guests. They had to pass in review before they could even enter. Arriving guests had a long initial approach to the center of the palace. They then turned to the right and drove to the very end before turning around to drive back along the entire length of her palace. Tsarskoye Selo became the perfect setting for cavalcades of military power, like this one in honor of the last Tsar, Nicholas II, who took up permanent residence here after the First Russian Revolution in 1905. These richly colored facades appear themselves to be marching in a long parade of columns and statuary. Inside, the procession begins afresh. The visitor is beckoned to progress down a whole enfilade of increasingly sumptuous rooms. finally, guests reached the great climax of the palace, the spectacular Golden Room of Light, the throne room where the Empress Catherine received her guests in a forest of gold. Rastrelli's most extravagantly decorated room was inlaid with golden amber, a present from the King of Prussia. It no longer exists, stolen by Hitler's retreating armies, and its whereabouts remain a mystery to this day. Although such palaces had no strategic importance, they were bombarded by German guns in World War II, reducing Rastrelli's original masterpiece of Tsarskoye Selo to ruins. The post-war Soviet regime instituted a vast program to restore Catherine's palace to its 18th century glory. To ease the contradictions of communists glorifying a monarch, they renamed it for the poet Pushkin. Catherine's predecessor, the Empress Elizabeth, had created the palace to give a European image to Russian power. This imperial style was soon imposed on other Russian cities, including Kiev, the mother of them all. Rastrelli's Church of St. Andrew blended Russian motifs into the Western Baroque style, transforming the traditional onion domes into elegant sculptural ornaments.
The Empress Elizabeth laid the first stone in this church in 1744. The whole idea was that the Empress was now ruling over the southern steppe as well as the northern forests, and this would be a center of power and a chapel in which the Empress, whenever she was to visit the south, would come and worship. But it was no longer an old Russian church. It was a dramatic church illustrating the profound Western influences and the whole new world where architecture, silhouette, dominated Russia with statuary and elaborate decor rather than the old flat, ethereal and spiritualized icons of old Muscovy. Having a pulpit like this in an Orthodox church illustrates the radical change that Western influences made on the entire spirit of Russian culture in the middle of the 18th century. You wouldn't have seen a pulpit like this in a traditional Russian Orthodox church, and you certainly wouldn't see a picture of the Sermon on the Mount prominently featured in traditional Russian iconography, with its suggestion of the importance of preaching and worship services. But things were changing in the mid-18th century. Western influences in the wake of the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation were creeping in not just to the Ukraine, but to all of Russia. And of course, this icon screen is a totally different production from anything one would have seen in old Muscovy. The pictures now are entirely naturalistic, and they almost disappear into the three-dimensional world defined by the elaborate decor and the statues that give this all a kind of vibrant feeling. The icon screen is no longer square, but is in this curlicue shape of a Baroque church.
Rastrelli's architecture of artifice projected power back into the natural world.
In Tsarskoye Selo, when Rastrelli did put on the landscape a very important and strong composition, a very regular one certainly, one of the most interesting and biggest in the world. It is once more a kind of a part of a grid, if you like, of a Baroque grid which was put on the whole of Russia during the Baroque period. There were fortresses, there were the churches, there were towns, there were these big palaces. Lomonosov, the main poet of the spirit and the main Russian scholar, He wrote that Tsarskoye Selo is a constellation of stars which could be spread over the whole Russia and over the whole world, and that it could be compared only with the empire of Rome. That was near to Catherine. But this was a strange image of Rome. It was a Baroque Rome, much more rich, much more decorated, barbaric, as if the barbarians took over the Rome of the antiquity and decorated it and tried to restore it. Catherine the Great took all these ideas. How Rastrelli understood this idea of power installed in architecture.
Beyond the well-ordered gardens lay parkland that could never even be weeded, the so-called wild growth. The vast spaces of an ever-expanding empire could never be enclosed. Nevertheless, Catherine, in building the great park at Tsarskoye Selo, tried to do with nature what she often did with her courtiers, attempt both to subdue and to embrace. Russia's great historian of culture, Dmitry Likhachov, sees Tsarskoye Selo as balancing the needs of people with the concerns of nature.
В пейзажном парке происходит соединение человеческого начала.
The importance of the landscape park is that it shows the unity of man and nature, the human presence in nature harmonized with nature herself. This relationship of nature and man in these ecologically difficult times is very important. My dream is that the entire world is turned into a park, as in Milton's Paradise. This park should be like this landscape park, man and nature so perfectly combined.
Человеческое начало и природное начало.
In the early 19th century, Russian literature suddenly came to life, beginning with Russia's most beloved poet, Alexander Pushkin. He grew up in the grounds of Tsarskoye Selo. He always yearned for it. Куда бы нас ни бросила судьбина, из счастья куда б ни повело, все те же мы, нам целый мир чужбина, отечество нам Царское Село. Literature brought to life the human side of an often inhuman Petersburg, never more so than in Pushkin's famous poem, The Bronze Horseman. Pushkin, the founder of Russia's humanistic literature, juxtaposed this mighty monument, the statue of the Bronze Horseman that Catherine dedicated to Peter the Great. He juxtaposed this mighty monument to the small, beaten-down clerk who was pursued by it during the flood of 1825. And this hero, this little hero of his famous poem, The Bronze Horseman, was multiplied 1,000 times in the prose literature of Pushkin's chosen successor as the literary hope of Russia, Nikolai Gogol, the small man who came in from the countryside, as it were, and with his rather frail feet somehow crushed all these mighty monuments with his satire. Gogol came to St. Petersburg in 1828, an insecure and frightened young man, fresh from the Ukrainian countryside. Of all the worlds in which Gogol lived, the rural Ukraine always had a special place in his heart. Whether it was his actual youth lived here as he grew up in these relatively mellow human surroundings so beautifully integrated with nature, or whether it was later in his first stories, which he dazzled St. Petersburg with, of the strange witches and fables and enormous encounters that occurred in this countryside, this was the part of the world in which Gogol felt most at home. The Ukraine appealed to him partly because, of course, it was the beginning of the great feathergrass steppe that spread out across central Eurasia. But here it was still bounded in by trees, had a kind of human scale. There was always something that gave a sense of home to Gogol, this man who was forever on the road. In his early Ukrainian short stories, Gogol echoed the supernatural fears of country people, particularly in his tale of the nightmarish monster called V. Gogol brought with him to Petersburg simple but terrifying peasant tales, memories of the Ukrainian puppet theater. Into the city of great salons, he brought the little sprites and demons of the rural imagination. The boy from the country initially dreamed of becoming something as grand as Petersburg itself, an architect or high official, a historian of the world. But he soon fled from the imperial parade into the side streets and the crowded arcades of the city. In his Petersburg stories, Gogol wrote about an abused clerk deformed into thinking that wearing an overcoat was the highest human aspiration. For 15 years, Yuri Norstein has struggled to create an animated screen version.
The overcoat has been a strange experience for me. I first read this story when I was 11 years old. And I remember how I was terrified by the words of Akaky Akakievich. "Leave me alone, why are you hurting me?" I was terrified because these are the words of a child. But here we hear them from an adult. I have to learn more about him as I work. I cannot say how he will behave in the next part of the film. I have to get closer to him, and then I learn from this character how he will behave, what he will do. This may sound paradoxical, because it's animation. Your character must be drawn before he can do anything. But before you draw him, you have to know what he will do. It is an exclusive circle. Sometimes you start a new scene, and it's very hard to start, since you don't know how to break the circle. From which point to start?
Поскольку не знаешь, где этот круг разорвать, с какой точки начать новый как бы цикл. И тогда я к этому...
But then I look for a new gesture of his, and from this comes my opportunity to extend the action for Akaki.
Он сразу даст мне возможность развернуть все действие.
Все эти руки напоминают иконописание, где духовное значение иконов всегда изображается через руки, через лик. Это случайно или это имеет какое-то взаимоотношение с вашим произведением?
Я не могу сказать, что это случайно, но я...
I cannot say that the hands are accidental, because I didn't know for sure how the film would develop when I started. Later on, hands appeared to be the most important thing for this character, since his hands are his trade. He writes his letters with his fingers.
При помощи рук он пишет буквы свои.
Gogol's stories have been an inspiration to the famous Russian clown Slava Polunin.
Why did I choose Gogol? Probably because he is the closest character to me in Russian literature. For me, Gogol is one of the weirdest, most fantastic writers. It is not possible to understand him. He always leaves half the story unfinished. His muse is a muse of the tragically absurd. This was clear even in the 19th century. Gogol was an absolute artist whose literature was 100 years ahead of his time. He is an enigma. His poetry is eternal. It runs away from you all the time. It always eludes you. For example, Bashmachkin in The Overcoat cannot merely be read as a vulnerable little man, needing pity or protection. It's all nonsense, because it's only on the surface. Beneath it all lies a great mystery, as if a huge overcoat was suspended over St. Petersburg. I admire all his characters. Think of his story, The Nose. There is something in the story so infinite that all life, all literature is gathered together on a few pages.
The great composer Dmitri Shostakovich made Gogol's short story The Nose into his first opera. It opened with a sneeze, defied established musical convention, and was long banned under communism. Shostakovich heard this opera for the very first time in more than 30 years at this special performance in the months before he died.
That's typical Russian, you know. I think that's this fantasy, if nose coming separate of the human beings.
Yes.
You know, that's, I think this fantasy must be coming only for Russians and a little bit after vodka. But that's so geniusly fantasy, you know. Nose have separate life.
Gogol inspired many of the earliest Russian films and remains an inspiration to filmmakers today.
Gogol is very rich in details, and Eisenstein wrote that Gogol is the best teacher for a film director to find real details to explain the very deep meaning of reality.
Gogol's characters are instantly recognized by Russians. His most famous play, The Inspector General, captures the unchanging and petty meanness of Russian provincial life.
Я сам видел, проходя мимо кухни. Где сауна?
The play is so well known by Russian audiences that its essential meaning can survive the most experimental production, like this one, directed by Vladimir Mirzoyev.
I think Gogol was produced a lot in the recent time in Russia, because before in Russia the primarily important was collective mind, and right now in Russia the position of individual or the position of person is most important search. Basically, we live in some transition, in some liquid-like historical moment where Gogol is perfectly appropriate author, because his creations, they reflect the same state of things and the same state of mind. When people don't know exactly where they're going, they're looking for basic metaphysical answers on metaphysical questions. Gogol can be this mirror for the collective subconsciousness, can bring shadows into the light, and can help people to understand their own motivations, their own movements in the world.
After everyone in town has made a fool of himself, the mayor turns to the audience and says, "What are you laughing at? You're laughing at yourselves." Gogol became increasingly depressed. The immense public success of his comedies and short stories seemed paradoxically only to deepen his personal sense of failure. He left Russia for Italy, drawn to his friend, the painter Alexander Ivanov, who was completing an enormous religious painting in Rome. Gogol was not satisfied with writing. He admired Ivanov's aspiration to produce a huge single work of art that would redeem Russia, if not the world. In Rome, Ivanov drew around himself a circle of friends, many of whom would model for this ambitious undertaking. The model Maria Mariuka was a particular inspiration. Ivanov made many oil sketches of her, which were curiously transformed into young men in his massive canvas. Ivanov became the first important Russian painter to draw directly from nature by sketching trees and landscapes in the open air. He visited Roman baths to capture the natural positions of young boys clambering out of water. They eventually emerged from the River Jordan on both sides of his gigantic picture. Ivanov journeyed to Jerusalem in his search for authentic biblical faces and the luminous light of the Holy Land. He was trying to depict the first appearance of Christ to the people, which he felt was a transforming moment in human history, capable of rekindling Russian spirituality. Ivanov tried out many versions, endlessly regrouping his figures around the risen Christ. Even the Tsar became fascinated with this project and personally visited the painter in Rome in 1845. The artist agonized over how to depict Christ in a way that would be both authentic and inspirational. He turned to the masters of the Renaissance and to the classical god of beauty, Apollo. Nearest to Christ, Ivanov placed his great friend, Nikolai Gogol. In an early version, we see Gogol with his head turned away from Christ, perhaps feeling his unworthiness. Then, in Ivanov's final canvas, Gogol faces his Redeemer, nearest to God, an almost Christ-like figure himself.
It was a colossal, huge undertaking that he eventually finished, but as you can see, the dominant figure is John the Baptist. Christ disappears almost into the background because in the course of it, he began to see Christ not as a redemptive figure, but just as another human being. And people said that it was not the appearance of Christ to the people, but the disappearance of Christ into the people. For this painting to be redemptive, it had to be an accurate picture of the most beautiful, the most positive things that had ever happened. Ivanov, cheered on all the time by his close friend Gogol, who put great hopes in this painting. This overload of hope and expectation was to be characteristic of Russian historical painting, and the monumental approach with the ultimate inability to capture in the new religious painting the faith that had existed in the older iconography. Gogol's last and greatest work was Dead Souls, which is the story of a man who travels all over Russia, a man named Chichikov with a kind of frivolous sounding name. And he's on a vaguely perverted mission of buying up dead souls, the title to serfs, who are already dead, but which gives him added prestige as an aristocrat. And in the process, he goes all over Russia and meets all kinds of sort of caricatures of people living in provincial Russia.
Пожалуйста, подпишите.
Бричка готова. Только ты, отец мой, не обидь меня.
Не обижу, матушка. Ну, прощайте, матушка Настасья Петровна.
Промахнулась. Продала втридорога шива. В город надо ехать, узнать, почем ходят мертвые души.
For Russians, Dead Souls has a continuous relevance. The idea, on the one hand, that you rush out and find somewhere in the purity of the Russian countryside some kind of positive message, but on the other hand, the realization that it is a deep corruption that penetrates all of Russia, and even those who go out on their mission, like Chichikov.
Рус, куда несешься ты? Дай ответ. Не дает ответа.
But still, there was always the idea that you should press on, and after the first part of Dead Souls, this wonderful panoramic but kind of depressing view of the Russian countryside.
Gogol was trying to write a second and third part to complete what would be the Russian Divine Comedy. Unfortunately, he was never able to do it, and ended up instead rhapsodizing about the old muddy roads of Russia and about the Troika itself.
Гоголь, с моей точки зрения, не реалистический человек.
I believe that Gogol was not a realistic man, but at the same time he was a realist. To quote, "A troika, bird troika, you race on and everything on earth is flying back." One can take this as practically the Bolshevik or national anthem. But the man in the troika is a thief.
В воске-то едет вор, потому что если бы без этого, если бы эта тройка везла бы положительного героя...
If the troika was driven by a good man, it wouldn't be Gogol. It would simply be a clever writer who can put words together with talent.
А именно то, что едет вор в этой штуке, дает ту многоплановость необыкновенную, которая и является каким-то...
But the fact that our hero is a thief gives Dead Souls an extraordinary further dimension. The cheat is traveling on. You cannot read him in a single meaning. This is the funny thing about Gogol.
Он не то, что вот прямая. Гоголь — это какое-то кольцо всегда.
Dostoevsky, he said, we came from Gogol's overcoats, not from Pushkin, who was earlier, because Gogol has for the first time created this sinking into nothingness, and nothingness is devil. It's the diminishing of good. I think it was for the first time when this figure of the little devil comes into the Russian literature, because actually Chichikov is the devil for Gogol. He has this devilish goal, buying souls. Although everything is very realistic and very funny as well. Gogol tried to save Chichikov, and he couldn't. As a writer, he could not do that. And that was a torture for Gogol. His writing was always a torture, because it was as if he was following devil in his traces on Russian space.
I think Dead Souls reflects everything about Russia. Because there is no one decent person in the whole novel, and you still like him. You still like all of them, but they're all monsters. In that sense, it's a fantastic parabola or metaphor for the world. Be able to love shortcomings. This is the beginning of compromise and understanding human nature.
Gogol was not only the most wonderful writer, he was also a man of acute spiritual vision, a mystic who saw into the depths of the human soul. Gogol's greatest achievement was to express the spiritual nature of the Russian Church in literature, to present it in a new way to many people, in particular to the intelligentsia of the 19th century.
Gogol inspires the surrealist sculptors of today.
When I start a new piece, I don't know how it will turn out. In this case, everything grew out of the nose and the carriage. And you think, who could this be? Nose and carriage. Nose and carriage. Nose and carriage. It's Chichikov. The worn-out way it looks reminds me of Russia. Worn out and decrepit. Everything appears to move in the same direction. At least the wheels give the impression it's moving. But in reality, it's going nowhere. Even if it does move, it moves nowhere. This is the image of Russia today. She's heading nowhere. It seems to me that she will need perhaps 500 years now to find her way. That's it.
Why, I often ask myself, do so many great Russian works like Gogol's Dead Souls remain unfinished?
You see, the most important thing for the writer, as well as for the composer and the artist, is the process of creation, the process of thinking. That's when he creates. When he has brought a theory into being, he stops thinking about it, he loses interest in it. This is characteristic of Russians and the Russian intelligentsia. It's a kind of a national psychology.
This man had the greatest gift to turn the music of the world into the music of words. This is the most important thing about him. He was not a satirist. He did not denounce the social order in his country. He was simply a man who saw everything, funny and sad, about human life. He didn't want simply to laugh at it. He wanted to tell people about it with great compassion. That's why he said, "Through the laughter which the world can see, there are invisible tears." It's not accidental that on his gravestone is the cry of the prophet Jeremiah. They laugh at my bitter words. They laugh at my bitter words. What a combination.
Unlike Pushkin, Gogol has few state memorials in Russia. He continues to be too elusive and disturbing a figure to be easily canonized by anyone. In St. Petersburg, there is little to indicate that his most famous tales were written here, in an apartment 3 floors up. Today, it's not a museum, but a simple apartment where a teenage Anya shares Russia's enduring fascination for the works that Gogol wrote there.
Но главное, очень мало людей, которые любят Гоголя. Я лично
Not that many people really like Gogol. I'm not sure that I understand him properly. I think you need to be older to understand him. Gogol writes so oddly. He's a sort of a crazy writer, but real cool.
The world of Gogol is almost more relevant today than it was in Gogol's own time. Most important of all is this attempt to create a literature or an art that will transform and not merely entertain the Russian people. And he has a complex legacy, really, because on the one hand, he inspired the revolutionaries who eventually created the communist revolution, but at the same time, the literary dissidents who helped overthrow it with the power of their own words. When Gogol returned from Italy, he spent the last years of his life living, as he said, like a monk in this world, writing short meditations on religious themes. In this room in his Moscow home, he put himself under an ascetic self-discipline that seems, in effect, to have slowly starved him to death. Gogol despaired that he would ever finish Dead Souls, his great redemptive work. He had written the negative part, but only fragments of the positive. And so here, 10 days before he died, he slowly delivered the positive part of his vision into the fires that slowly consumed it as his 15-year-old servant looked on, despairing, not realizing what was being lost forever. By the time of his death in 1852, Gogol believed that literature and painting had both failed to provide Russia with a positive message. He wrote that architecture, too, had lost all grandeur, even though St. Isaac's Cathedral was already thrusting up on the Petersburg horizon. Its dome was to be so large that it eventually became the first to be supported by iron, and indeed the engineering model for the future dome of the U.S. Capitol. Gogol left behind an unpublished fragment, suggesting what might be the next art form to give Russians fresh hope. Only in music, he wrote, does man have freedom. The sound of bells had prompted Gogol to suggest at the end of the first part of Dead Souls that Russia's troika itself might, like music, that most immaterial of all the arts, take off into space and perhaps deliver Russia to that spiritual destination which he himself had spent a tortured lifetime seeking.
Major funding for this program was provided by the Open Society Institute. And by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
Corporate funding for this program is made possible by Dresser Industries. Energy is our business.
And by ADM. Feeding the world is the biggest challenge of the new century. ADM, supermarket to the world.